Hello. I'm so happy today to introduce you to my new friend, Michaela O'Donnell. Is that right? And
Said
she
it
is
right.
from the LA Pasadena area and she works for Fuller Seminary. And if you could just explain what the Max Dupree Center for Leadership is, because did you found it or you just run it?
No, I did not found it. I just run it. Sue, it's good to be with you. Thanks
Thank
for
you.
having me on
Sure.
today. The Max Dupree Center for Leadership is named after, you guessed it, Max
Max.
Dupree. Yes, he was the longtime CEO of Herman Miller, which is an office furniture company. I'm actually sitting in one of their chairs right now,
Ooh, wow.
the Aeron chair. And he was also a longtime board member of Fuller. So he was somebody who people describe as having a seamless life. He was, the same person in the boardroom
Mm.
as he was in his CEO role, as he was with his employees, as he was with his family. So a big part of what we do is try to help people have that same kind of integration between faith and work in the rest of their life, wherever God has called them in terms of work and leadership.
And tell me his name again, Herman.
The company is called Herman Miller. Some of the
Okay.
most famous designers that worked there were Charles and Ray Eames. They're sort of a cult
Wow.
following behind them. Really quality furniture that is comfortable to sit in and beautiful to look at.
I love the idea of seamless, living
Mhm.
seamless. Maybe we can explore that a little bit more as we go on. You're also described as an entrepreneur and a practical theologian. Now, in contrast to an impractical theologian, is there even a place for an impractical theologian? Are they just the researchers, their head in the clouds, or does God love them as much as they love you, or what?
Yeah, no, I don't think I should say that God doesn't love anybody as much as me. I might be getting into trouble. I might not
Yeah.
like how that one turns out, Sue.
No.
Practical theology is a whole discipline that sits sort of next to systematic theology, which sits next
Oh.
to biblical theology. And each of them have their own, it's really about where do you start? So biblical theologians, they start with the Bible every time. Systematic, and all the starting points are good. Let me say that too.
Okay.
Systematic theologians, they start with what are the big ideas that the Christian faith holds, right? What do we think about Christ and about salvation and et cetera? Practical theologians start with what's going on in the world right now and how might faith speak into it. So
Wow.
that's what I mean by practical theology. And that's what the discipline is intended to do.
So it's really a real thing because I've heard of systematic theology.
Yeah.
And what was that other one? The
Biblical theology.
biblical theology. Yeah. Isn't it all biblical? Yes.
Yes.
But I would call myself one now. I'm going to call myself. What am I?
Please do.
I'm a practical theologian
Welcome to the
because
club, Sue. We're glad to have you.
thank you. Hmm. I'm not going to work on a doctorate though. But yeah, because the whole thing is bringing Jesus into real life.
Yeah.
Now, because he's here, people
Yeah.
just don't know.
Yeah.
And so when I have wine nights and invite my friends over and we do conversation starters, that's practical theology. I have to tell you, I have a friend who I met at the thrift store because we kept shopping there. And she came and now she tells everybody she's going to her Bible study. And all it
Mm.
is we sit and we just share when we share life together. And it's actually a wine night. And I try not to laugh too hard, but she goes, "Oh, I only come." She doesn't believe in God. She doesn't believe in God. So
Huh.
I kind of feel like we're doing practical theology, though my
We
mother wouldn't
absolutely are.
approve, but she's in heaven drinking the real stuff. So let's go back to you. I did ask you that question. Explain the difference between a calling. Well, first of all, let's just say the name of your book because it is amazing. And you do remind me a little bit of Jordan Rayner, Make
Yeah.
Work Matter, Your Guide to Meaningful Work in a Changing World. What a beautiful, beautiful title. I have so many questions. How long did it take you to write it?
Yeah.
How long
Good
did it take you?
question.
Oh, good question.
Well, it's a two-part thing.
Oh,
So what's in here was actually the basis of what I studied when I was getting my doctorate.
okay.
But you might imagine that there are not many people, including myself, who want to spend time reading dissertations in
Right.
depth. Right. This is too much. And not as practical as even my discipline would say that we
Mhm.
need. So converting and finding new stories and interweaving my own life journey as an entrepreneur in with it, that
Mhm.
took the better part of, a year and a half to have the version that we can hold in our hands now.
Okay. And why, what is the difference between a calling or a vocation and a job? I was talking to my sister the other day, and she's a Lutheran pastor's wife. And she goes, Sue, we talk a lot about vocation in the Lutheran world. Well, I didn't know that, but I think I do too. But
Mhm.
I'd like to know your interpretation of a vocation or calling versus a job.
That's such a good question. I think it's a question a lot of people have.
Mm,
And ironically, or maybe providentially, I think Martin Luther did
mm.
some really interesting work on this. So, Martin Luther, I'll give you the practical, digestible version of
Thank you.
Luther here. Yes. So, Martin Luther was in a time period where people were talking about spiritual work as the work that priests and nuns and
Mm,
monks did. And Martin Luther was like, wait a minute, what about the priesthood of all believers? What
there we
about
go.
what about the whole kingdom of God? What about the baker or the candlestick maker or the mother or father? And really, he and his contemporaries in the Reformation said, actually, all work can be spiritual. Okay, but Sue, stay with me here. So then what
Okay.
happened is he's writing in kind of an agrarian, farming, localized age. Then society started to move from farming to an industrial age, eventually to kind of what we're in right now. We're talking over computers in
Right.
information age.
Right.
And that idea of calling kind of kept going with it. But instead of expanding to be contextualized in each of those ages, somewhere along the way, we started thinking about calling as a job we love, right? And
Mm,
calling that's not actually a biblical understanding of calling. Calling is much more, it's much more liberating than that, actually. The very core, what calling means, I think about Jesus first calling his disciples on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. And he's like, hey, y'all, follow me,
mhm.
right? Follow me, this core belonging and this central thing. And yeah, God does then call people to particulars, to friendships and to places. And yeah, sometimes to jobs and roles, but job and vocation are not synonymous. It's a context in which we live out this larger sense of belonging to God and being a follower of Christ, but it's one of many contexts. I'll stop there. That was quite the history lesson.
Yeah, no, it was great. And it was interesting that you mentioned Luther because I'm sure that's where they got it.
Yep.
And I wonder when the breakdown went. I think in every age, people start living for themselves and for the bottom line, which is the dollar, or
Mm-hmm.
for pride. And so then they get away from really the main calling that God calls us to, which is to deny ourselves and to love him and others. Do you differentiate between the words calling and vocation? Are you using them interchangeably?
They're pretty interchangeable. I
Okay.
mean,
Okay.
the word vocation is a Latin word that, basically means to be called.
Oh,
And
okay.
so, and so the, and sometimes in English, when we use the word vocation, we think about people who have ministry positions. And I think that divide has actually been, I still talk to a lot of people where they think, oh, my work isn't as spiritual, or I
As
don't even
yours.
know how God, yeah,
Right.
as
Mhm.
yours. I'm
Right.
like, oh, wait a minute, let's go all the way back
Mhm.
and all the way back forward. So those words really have the same root meaning.
Well, I can see, thank you for answering that. I can
Yeah.
see how we might put people who are professional Christians, they get paid for being a preacher or a
Yeah.
professor at a Christian university like yourself or a seminary, um, put them up on a pedestal because, for one thing, they're usually up. They are actually literally on a stage.
Literally. Yeah.
And so you're looking up to them. And of course, they fall farther and it hurts more when they do, which is a whole nother story.
Amen.
But I can see that because Jesus called plain, ordinary men out of a plain, ordinary profession, which was fishing.
Yep.
And he called them to go be fishers of men. So you can see why people could confuse that. And
Mhm.
yet, what he was doing was just getting his followers to go spread the good news all over the world, because that's what
Yeah.
happened as a result of them being obedient to that. Um, is it important as a believer? Does it really matter what job we have or work we do?
It's a
Does it
really
really
good
matter?
That's a really good question. Does it really matter? I mean, I think that there are lots of factors in here, right? Most of us have bills we have to pay. Some of us have kids we have to take care of. We have the way that society works, one needs money to be able to function. And so I think it would be unwise and unfair to swing the pendulum all the way to say, hey, everything we do for work has to matter in its most extreme sense to us all the time. I actually think that's a narrow percent of the population can think like that. Not everybody has, I'll use the word privilege to just think about that, right? Because we've got these
Mhm.
things that we're paying for. Now, let me say this. Do I think that I'll say every, sure, we could maybe make some exceptions, but do I think any place that God has us is an opportunity for meaningful work? Yes, I do.
Mhm.
Absolutely. Because I think, most of us are called, as believers, we're called into that belonging, into that followership, which often takes the shape of little opportunities to uplift each other, little opportunities to sow goodness into something that feels broken,
Mhm.
little opportunities to push the margins on systems that work for some and not for others. And so I think there is opportunity for meaningful work almost anywhere we find ourselves. Now, I'll add one more thing there. That's not meant as a way to say, no matter where you are, you should just stay there. Sometimes I think there are very, very reasonable reasons for leaving. And sometimes I think God invites us into newness and sometimes more fullness as a part of, our next step and I'll say walk with God. But I think there's opportunity for meaning almost anywhere we find ourselves.
Totally agree. When I got married out of being a full-time missionary with Wycliffe Bible Translators. And because my husband wasn't a member, then I left the organization. And I was fine with that. But I had a friend say, I'm so sorry you got married because you always wanted to be a full-time missionary.
Mm,
I was so surprised because she knew I wanted to get married and I was 35. And I said, oh, well, you know what? People in San Luis Obispo need Jesus. That's all
mm,
I said,
yep.
but it kind of startled me because it wasn't her fault. That was her view of me. We have
Right.
perspectives of people, and that's what she thought. I was grieving that. I go, oh no, it's just a different place. It's like God places us. God has moved. As interesting, you brought that thing about sometimes we
Yeah.
do need to move. God has moved me into different jobs or vocations, even um through boredom. Like it
Mm,
wasn't a real big
wow.
spiritual reason. I go, I need a change. And I think God, he made me someone who needs change. So then he uses that to get me into another place. And that's where he wants to fulfill his calling through me. Not that I want to talk about
Wow.
me, but I think it's okay to go ahead and move out of a different reason, not just because you had this
Yeah.
great, vision from the Lord or something.
Well, Sue, I think what you said is pretty brilliant. And I think it's interesting. I think it's brilliant because it's so critical to recognize the patterns of how God has been faithful and worked with us, right? I think that that's the foundation for how we keep going and how we keep walking and pursuing, in this case, in sort of my area of discussion, meaningful work. And the other reason why I think it's brilliant and provocative is because many people are wired very differently than the way you just described.
Mhm.
Many people experience change as really difficult, really unsettling.
Mhm.
I'm not a mental health professional, but even traumatizing. And so there's all this resistance that comes, right, as a result of that change. And that's where I'll go back to the stories of the disciples. One of the reasons why I love the simple invitation to follow me is because it necessitates this step by step thing, right? Walking step by step. And for those of, I'm with you. I like change. I'm an entrepreneur. I like the new stuff. But for those of us that change is scary, it helps to break it down into what might the next thing God be calling you to be? But just one little risk, one little relationship, one little idea, so that we're not always talking about big, scary changes that can, for some people, be so uncomfortable.
So true. I've even called my mentor, especially when my kids were little, and I would be asked to do something in ministry. And I'd say, should I do this?
Mm,
And she said, I'm not going to tell you what to do, but if it's investing in people or the word, then you can't go wrong
hmm.
because they both last forever. And then
Wow.
she also says, trust God and do the next thing, which is a lot of people attribute that phrase to Elizabeth Elliot, but I read it in the biography of Oswald Chambers, who wrote My Utmost for
Hmm.
His Highest. So I could be misremembering, but it doesn't matter. It's a great line. And of course, it's from the Psalms where you know, just you trust God in the land and you do the next thing. And
Right.
so, well, we're not really talking about God's guidance here, but we are because people work is meaningful. And I or can be devastating actually, but I think what you're saying can be particularly helpful to moms. And I
Hmm.
don't just say that because I am a mom, but I remember when I got pregnant for the first time, my little sister who'd been married since, birth practically and already had children said, Sue, finally what you're saying to women will be legitimatized because
Hmm.
they are in the throes of being moms of young children. That's where you're at.
Yep.
And all of a sudden, you feel like, well, what am I doing today that's actually meaningful or matters to the next
Yeah.
generation, even because I'm just really trying hard to scrape the Cheerios off the floor, or
Yep.
my kids keep fighting, or my daughter was nice until she was 9. I mean, I remember the day when she was first mean to her sister, and I thought, oh, I failed as a mother.
Hmm.
There's all these things because women today are,
Yep.
I mean, my mother didn't go to college and she always felt all 5 of us were going to go to college. And she felt less than. And
Hmm.
I think society can put less than, especially on women, unless they reach a certain salary or a
Yep.
level in a company. But as one coach told me once, she goes, you can do all the things, but not all at the same time.
Yeah. And not all at the same time well, right?
Exactly.
I mean, this is a question, Sue. I think what you're bringing up is really important too. First of all, Cheerios. I quite literally scraped Cheerios off of the table this morning after my
Oh.
2-year-old son. So that's a very relevant and real life example. But I'm thinking about two things right now. My daughter, she has transitioned into kindergarten, and I was talking with my mom the other day. I've got a book coming out, and life is more full than in a different way. It is denser than I have ever experienced professionally because of this book. I'm very grateful for that. I was talking to my mom, and she's like, what feels most important right now? What are you really investing in? And I said, in my kid, like she's making a transition to kindergarten. That is one of the biggest transitions that she's going to make. And
Mhm.
so we have carved out all of this extra time just to talk about morning bins and snack time and so and so on the playground. And I don't, this is not this work is more important than this work, but it is, you're bringing light to the reality that there are these overlapping spheres of influence that we have. And this is where I go back to Max Dupree. How do we live seamlessly? How do we live seamlessly in those spheres of influence? And the last thing I'll say is I have a very good friend. We went to college, and she's right about to have her 4th kid. By the time she hears this, she will have had her 4th kid. And she said, Michaela, I really want to read your book as my nursing book. I was like, oh, you
Yeah.
need like fiction or
Yeah.
something. Let's get you a good TV show.
Yeah.
And she said, no, Michaela, I need to be reminded that what I'm doing right there is
Mm.
meaningful work. And that is right where God has me. So that is why I'm going to read this book as my nursing book.
I love that.
And that, Sue, that did something for me. I thought, yeah, she might, maybe you should author the next one, friend of mine. But they're just, so you're talking about that seamlessness and uplifting the good and holy work that has historically not always been uplifted, the work of women.
Right. And really I feel sorry for men because they don't get to do what we do, rather than
Right.
going, oh, I feel sorry for myself. Though I do recall, because I was in a career and so long, before having children, I did feel, I remember nursing Bonnie late at night and looking up on the shelf. I had these cute little shelves to decorate her nursery. And I thought, Lord, I'm up on that shelf now. I'm just on a shelf, metaphorically,
Mm.
where you can't,
Mm.
I can't do anything else. I wasn't sleeping well. So when you don't sleep well, you really can't do anything. And that's how I felt.
Yeah.
And to know that even that's just a season, and to have someone speak, an older woman speak into your life, you're like your dear mother, and that this book will speak into men's lives as well. But as a woman, I can't wait to read it myself, because we want our lives to matter, and everything we do is work. We may not get paid for it. I mean, I used to, when I started working part-time, I'd come home and my husband go, well, did you work today? I go, excuse me? I didn't work.
Oh my goodness.
I said, I didn't work. He didn't mean to be
Right. Of
patronizing.
course. Of course.
He's a very black and white. He just meant, did I get in the car and go somewhere? And as my friend said, tell Mark that his money is your money and your money is your money. But she goes, I never said that. Oh, yes, you did. But anyway, the thing was, I go, I work every day. I just don't get paid every day. And by the way, I'd like a raise. That's what I told him. But obviously we've worked it out.
Good.
Yeah, that's good. So why did you feel the leading to write this book? And I'm going to repeat the title because it's a beautiful one. Make Work Matter, Your Guide. So it's a guide. Is there like a workbook to meaningful work in a changing world?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I call it a guide because at the end of every chapter, there's exercises. And the exercises are not just things that I made up in my head and put in this book. They are things that have been road tested many, many times. Yeah. So in my work at the Max Dupree Center for Leadership, I'm building out resources and cohorts and other kinds of learning environment and workshops. And everything that's in this book has been, it's been road tested in those spaces. And it's been those spaces that actually motivated me to write the book. There are a lot of people who are kind of part grief, part hope about their work, who are a lot of, I've got some things that have went well and I don't know what to do next, right? Or gosh, things used to be more clear. And now that I'm juggling so much, I'm feeling a little overwhelmed. And that there's a lot of people, the data says that people undergo major life changes every 12 to 18 months now. That's just the rate of change in our world.
Wow.
And I know, it's overwhelming. And in the midst of that, we need spaces and tools to stop, to pause, to be transformed, to reflect, to talk to one another, to talk to God. And this book really is space to do that. I can't tell you how many people who have gotten early copies who are writing me and saying, one person, I had to read this really slow because I kept having to go journal about that. Or I need to get a copy for me and my husband so we can kind of both work through it. Or that story you told in about this person, that happened to me too. And I think that there's something significant about being able to find ourselves in a book, and that becomes reflective space. It becomes space where God speaks to us. And so it's for all those reasons and out of all those conversations that I wrote the book.
So it's full of stories too, not just data.
Full of stories. It's a lot of my own story. It's a lot of my own vulnerable story. People are like, oh my goodness, you're so vulnerable here. And I'm like, well, I think and actually to talk a little bit about the gendered thing, I think that's different than of the books we get on work, right? Different than the books we get on leadership and business. Those are all really great. And I read a lot of those. I'm not complaining or talking down about any of them, but there's something about the way that, and this is not exclusive to women, but there's something about the way that women talk and they lead, like empathy and vulnerability forward. And again, not exclusively and not all the time, but there you will see that tone in there as well.
Well, I'm excited because I read stories better than data. I have a question for you that I thought about when I was thinking about getting to talk to you today. If someone feels that their work doesn't matter, whether or not they're a stay-at-home mom or a professional out in the workforce, blue collar or whatever, Do they need to change their job, or do they need to change their perspective about their job?
That's a great question. I mean, it's so contextual, right? It
True.
might be yes, I think is my answer.
Yes.
But I'm actually going to go back to a story that you told here. So, you called up your mentor and you said, should I do this? Right? You got this question, this discernment question, this guidance question, which is
Right.
basically the same question we ask. And I think that there are so many times when it's hard to get out of our own head and really sort through the options. And so if there's somebody wrestling with, okay, my work doesn't feel meaningful, do I need to have a different perspective or do I need to change jobs? I would say start talking to people that you trust about that.
Mm.
Right. One last thing here. I'm thinking about First Samuel, and I'm thinking about the boy Samuel who's woken up in the middle of the night. He thinks by Eli calling his name. He runs to him and he's like, "Hey, what's up? What do you need?" Eli's like, "I didn't call you. Go back to sleep." He goes back to sleep. He hears his name again. Eli's like, "I didn't call you." And finally, Eli realizes, like, "Oh, you're hearing the voice of God."
Mm.
We need other people to teach us how to hear the voice of God. I think sometimes we think that's born, and for some of us it might be, but for many of us, got to cultivate that. So if you've got those questions, start getting with people in your life who might be good conversation partners to help you hear the voice of God.
Mm. That's beautiful. Yeah. Chambers said that all the questions of life could be answered in the phrase, come unto me, but we
Mm,
don't hear God's come unto me unless we take that time to reflect, to
yeah.
journal, and also just to be quiet.
Yeah.
And to have that space is difficult depending on where you are in life, but to make that a priority so that when you hear all the different voices, that you can discern which one is God calling you to do. Is he calling you to change your job? Is he calling you
Mhm.
to leave your state? I just interviewed Jennifer Dukes Lee. And so she and her husband were both in professions and they went back to the farm in Iowa. So
Wow.
she's written this book, Grow Slow, because
Yeah.
on the harvest. And it was a big, big, big change and kind of scary. And
Mm,
just because something's scary, it doesn't mean it's a no from God, because there's lots of
right.
scary things that God called people to in scripture, but we just hold on to him tighter. And maybe that's the real thing that we needed to learn, that we hold
Mm,
on to him tighter and that he can be
mm,
trusted. Now, my podcast is about legacy, and
yeah.
I could probably tell you what I think your legacy is, but I want to hear you say it. What do you think your legacy is that you want to make sure that you're leaving for those who love you and who live around you?
I think it's a fantastic question. I just love this question, Sue. When I think about my legacy, first of all, I think it's unfolding, right? And I think that there's just a nature of it unfolding. But I really want to invest in people. Kind of
Mhm.
like your mentor said, like if there's an opportunity to invest in people and help them become their best selves and help them realize that they really do matter. Who they are matters and what they do matters. And that requires a lot of sitting with people in tough stuff and empathizing with them, but also helping them imagine what might be and take risks for the path forward. So that's what I hope my legacy is.
Mm. How are you currently doing that?
Well, I think a lot of how I'm doing that is in some of the basics. So as a mom and a friend, right? As a wife and as a daughter. And then also in honestly in the book that I just wrote, this feels like an opportunity for me to invest in people, to remind them that they matter, to invite them into their own empathy and imagination and risk. Um, and I hope that's what it's doing.
Oh, and my brother, to encourage you, my brother Steve writes poetry
Mm,
as well as music. And he said, Sue, keep writing because I get discouraged.
yeah,
And he goes, keep writing because the written word will last. When you speak, they'll remember maybe 5 minutes. I go, oh, thanks a lot. But that's true. I don't remember when
yeah.
other people speak unless I've written something down that they've said.
Mm,
And and he said, so it's an enduring value. And
yeah.
so God has led you, Michaela. I want to encourage you that this is and ongoing. Yes, our legacies are unfolding, but we don't know how much time we have. And
Right.
God gave you that story to write, and you were vulnerable, you were obedient, and that is part of your legacy. And you can rest in that if you never write another word. So praise the
Mm.
Lord for that. What changes did you have to make or obstacles to overcome to work on this legacy of helping people feel like they matter?
Yeah, so I'm a very goal driven. Like when I do the strengths finders and things like that, strategic is number one.
Mm-hmm.
So I want what I envision to happen right away. And this work is sowing work. It's watering, intending, and it follows kind of that farming metaphor. And there is fruit, and I see it, but I've had to alter my expectations and grow in trust in the depth of this work,
Mm.
in addition to the big vision and sort of grand reach aspects that my mind kind of gravitates towards. And you know what, Sue, that has been honestly a holy reckoning for me.
Mm.
I love getting to be deep with people in this way, and I still have to kind of adjust expectations sometimes for myself. um, but I'm glad God's got me on this journey.
So, by holy reckoning, the fact that you have to wait for the fruit, is that what you meant?
Yeah, I want to like imagine it and
Right now.
have it right there. Yeah, right there.
Yeah, I think we're all a little bit that way. This same mentor says, Sue, God is never in a hurry. We're the ones with fast watches.
Mm,
That's a good
mm.
one, huh?
Yes, it is. It is.
What wisdom would you like to leave with my audience today?
Well, I think that the work, honestly, the meaningful work often starts not necessarily with what can I fix about myself or what might I do differently. And sometimes it's not even what is God saying to me. I think a lot of times it starts with moving toward one another. When I did all the research that stacked up into this book, one of the things that was very striking to me is that people were really making a difference, practiced a lot of empathy. And so my advice would be, how might you be interruptible today by the people who are to the left and to the right of you? Some of us are more wired for empathy than others. I think, and culturally conditioned for it. But I would say that empathy is a superpower. If you've got it, lean into it and leverage it. And if you don't have it, you too can grow, like I have along the way.
How would you define empathy?
I have a vision of it. So there's a lot of like, kind of data on this, but I really, the picture of the Good Samaritan is what comes to mind. Somebody who
Mm.
is already going from point A to point B, but can move out of their own route toward another person and say, I see you, I feel you, I'm here with you. Let's go together forward.
Mm.
And so it's that vision of the Good Samaritan that fills out my picture of what empathy is.
And for someone who's strategically motivated as yourself, I think that takes some hard intentionality to obey God, because we get interrupted.
Yep.
And we go, wait a minute, my to-do list didn't get finished. And when God brings someone into our life, I mean, I'm starting to design some to-do list notepads, and one is going to be called About My Father's Business. And then whatever is there, you're doing it for the Father. So whether it's someone's interrupted you 14 times that day, or you see an ambulance go down your street because you're outside talking, and you see what house it stops in, and then what can you make to take to that poor man whose wife just was whisked off, and he couldn't visit her because of COVID. So those are interruptions, but they're, as someone wisely said years ago, that our interruptions are God's appointments. And to have that perspective, but still finish something. Another wise woman in my church came for coffee the other day. This is a good thing too, is to have wise people around you, like you said earlier, so that they're pouring into your life. And she said, Sue, I like to tell young moms, if they could just do one thing, that they could finish one thing for the day, it just makes you feel so much better. Even if it's just to do a very short thing. Like, hey, I got those Cheerios off.
Yep.
That's it. Because you don't know what's around the corner. Well, you have been a delight, Michaela. I can't wait to give away your book and to read one for myself. And is there a way that people can connect with you?
Yes, I'm very excited for the Dupree Center to give away a couple copies of this book to your
Okay.
listeners. Yeah, and in the meantime, Dupree.org really is the best place to find me. That's
Okay.
DEPREE.org.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much. You're a blessing.
Thank you.
Hang in there with the Cheerios.
Yes.